The candle had burned down to nothing. Elsie noticed it the moment she stepped into the east corridor. The small brass holder on the wall bracket sat dark and cold, a thin ribbon of smoke still curling upward like a dying breath. She should have replaced it yesterday. She had meant to. But yesterday had brought its own avalanche of tasks, and the candle had slipped through the cracks the way small things always did when you were the kind of person no one thought to notice. She set her basket of linens down on the stone floor, pulled a fresh taper from her apron pocket, and pressed it into the holder with practiced hands. The flint sparked twice before the flame caught, and for a moment, the warm orange glow softened the severity of the corridor, the cold granite walls, the drafty ceiling, the faint smell of damp stone that never quite left this wing of the castle, no matter how many bundles of dried lavender the head housekeeper ordered. Elsie was 23 years old, and she had worked in Valen's castle for 4 of them. She was not the kind of woman who drew attention. Medium height, dark hair pulled back so tightly at the nape of her neck that it gave her temples a constant low ache. Brown eyes that noticed everything and revealed nothing. Her uniform was gray. They were all gray, the castle's domestic staff, and it fit her in the anonymous way a shadow fits a wall. She was useful, quiet, and almost entirely invisible, which was, she had long since decided, exactly how she needed to be. She lifted her basket again and continued down the corridor, her boots barely making a sound on the stone. The castle was enormous, 3 times larger than any structure she had known before coming here. And she had spent 4 years learning its rhythms the way a sailor learns the sea. She knew which floorboards groaned. She knew which drafts carried sound from one room to another. She knew exactly when the guards changed shifts in the West Tower and how to move through the corridors in the minutes between. She knew, above all else, how to stay out of sight. The East Wing was quiet this morning. Most of the court was still sleeping. The Alpha King's Council had held a banquet the night before, and the smell of spiced wine and roasted boar still clung faintly to the tapestries as she passed. She began the familiar work of her morning, gathering discarded linens from the rooms the guests had occupied, replacing water pitchers, straightening furniture that had been shoved carelessly aside. It was in the 3rd room that she found the small boy sitting in the middle of the floor. He was perhaps 6 years old, wrapped in a cloak 2 sizes too large for him, his dark hair sticking up on one side from sleep. He was holding a carved wooden wolf figurine, one of the decorative pieces from the mantelpiece, and turning it slowly in his hands with the focused expression of a child trying to understand something complicated. Elsie stopped in the doorway. The boy looked up. His eyes were an unusual color, pale gray, almost silver, and they assessed her with a directness that seemed too old for his small face. "You're the maid," he said, not unkindly, simply as a fact. "I am," she said, "and you're not supposed to be in here." "I know." He looked back down at the wolf. "I couldn't sleep. She should have called for someone, one of the court attendants or the boy's guardian, whoever had brought him to the castle." She recognized him now. Cale, the young son of one of the border lords, brought along on his father's diplomatic visit. She had seen him at the edges of the banquet the previous evening, ignored by the adults and quietly disappearing into the corners of the room. She knew that feeling well enough to recognize it. She set her basket down and crossed the room. She sat on the floor beside him, a thoroughly improper thing for a maid to do, and she knew it, and looked at the wolf figurine in his hands. "That one's old," she said. "See the wear on the paws. Someone carried it in their pocket for a long time before it ended up on that shelf." The boy turned it over, his brow furrowed. "How do you know?" "The edges go smooth when something's been held a lot. Stone does it. Wood does it too." She paused. "People do it sometimes." He considered this with great seriousness. Then he held the wolf out to her. "You keep it," he said. "I can't take that. It belongs to the castle." "Everything belongs to the castle," he said, with a resignation that no 6-year-old should have possessed. "Or to the king." Elsie opened her mouth to respond, and then heard the footsteps in the corridor. She was on her feet before she had consciously decided to move, instinct pulling her upright, her hand pressing the wolf figurine gently back into Cale's grasp. The footsteps were measured, deliberate, and accompanied by the faint sound of a second set, quieter, like a guard maintaining a respectful distance. She knew those footsteps. Every person in this castle knew those footsteps. She turned toward the doorway, and Alpha King Valen stood in it. He was tall enough that the doorframe seemed built for someone slightly smaller, and the morning light from the corridor caught the dark fabric of his coat and the iron gray of his eyes. He was not wearing his formal regalia. No crown, no ceremonial cloak. Just a dark riding coat, boots that had seen actual mud, and an expression that gave away nothing whatsoever. He was perhaps 35, and he wore authority the way other men wore skin. Not as something put on, but as something grown into, inseparable. His gaze moved first to the boy, then to Elsie. She dropped into a proper curtsy immediately, her eyes going to the floor. Her heart was doing something loud and inconvenient in her chest. "Your Majesty," she said. "Forgive the disruption. The young lord couldn't sleep. I can see what you were doing," he said. His voice was low. Not unkind, she thought, with a flicker of surprise. But not warm either. Neutral in the way that only people with absolute power could afford to be. When you needed nothing from anyone, you could sound like weather. Like stone. A long pause. "Leave the linens," he said finally. "Take the boy back to the attendants' quarters." "Yes, Your Majesty." She reached out her hand to Cale. The boy looked at the king with those silver eyes, unafraid, which surprised her, and then slid his small hand into hers and stood up. They were almost at the door when Valen spoke again. "What is your name?" She stopped, turned halfway. "Elsie, Your Majesty. East Wing Domestic." Something moved through his expression, too quickly for her to read it. Then it was gone. "You've been here 4 years," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Majesty." He looked at her for one more moment. Just looked, the way a man looks at something he's walked past 100 times, and suddenly, for reasons he cannot explain, stopped to examine. Then he stepped aside to let her pass. Elsie walked out of the room with Cale's hand in hers. Her eyes forward, her breathing controlled, every instinct she had screaming at her to walk faster. She did not run. She never ran. Running drew attention, and attention was the one thing she could not afford. But that evening, when her shift was finished, and the castle had settled into its nighttime quiet, she went to the small room she shared with 2 other maids on the lowest floor of the East Wing, and she sat on the edge of her narrow bed, and she thought about the way he had said her name. Elsie. Like he was testing the weight of it. Like he had heard it somewhere before, and was trying to remember where. She pressed her hands flat against her knees to stop them from trembling, and told herself it was nothing. It was a chance encounter. He had already forgotten her. Men like Valen did not carry the names of maids. She was wrong about that. She discovered it 3 days later, when she went to replace the candles in the corridor again, and found him there, standing at the window at the far end, alone, looking out at the gray morning sky. He turned when he heard her step, and Elsie understood, with a cold clarity that ran straight down through her chest, that Alpha King Valen had not wandered into this corridor by accident. He had been waiting. No one waited for maids. That was the first rule Elsie had learned when she arrived at the castle. Not spoken aloud, not written in any handbook of conduct, but woven into every interaction between the staff and the people they served. You were background. You were furniture that moved. You appeared when needed and disappeared when not. And the measure of your competence was precisely how little anyone noticed you doing your job. So, when the Alpha King turned from that window and looked at her with those iron gray eyes, she did what 4 years of training had made automatic. She dropped her gaze. She adjusted her grip on the candle basket. She said, "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I'll return when you've finished." and began to step back. "Stay," he said. One word. Quiet, but absolute in the way that all his words were absolute. Not because he raised his voice, but because the alternative, disobeying, simply didn't seem to exist in the same space as him. She stayed. He turned back to the window. Outside, the sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with clouds that hadn't decided yet whether to deliver rain or simply threaten it. The courtyard below was busy with grooms and supply carts, the distant clang of the blacksmith shop already ringing out across the stone. "You grew up outside the capital," he said. It was not a question, which meant he had asked someone, or looked somewhere, or done something that a king had no particular reason to do regarding an East Wing maid. Her hands tightened on the basket handle. "Yes, Your Majesty. A village 2 days' ride north. Caro's Mill. Small place. Very small." A pause. The kind of pause that had texture to it. Something being weighed or measured or carefully approached from the side. "You have family there still?" And there it was. The question she had spent 4 years making sure no one at this castle ever thought to ask. She kept her voice level. "My mother, Your Majesty. She lives alone." "You visit her?" "When I'm permitted leave. Twice a year." He was quiet for a moment. She watched his reflection in the wavy glass of the window, the set of his jaw, the slight tension in his shoulders. He was not a man who asked questions idly. She had seen him in council sessions, heard through the corridors the way he spoke to his advisors, precise, purposeful, nothing wasted. Which meant every question he was asking her had a direction. She just couldn't see it yet. "And your father?" he asked. "Gone," she said, "before I was born." He turned from the window then, fully, and looked at her in a way that made it very hard to maintain the neutral expression she had spent years constructing. "Did your mother ever speak of him?" Something cold moved through her, slow and careful, like water finding its level. "No," she said. And it was true. Her mother had not spoken of him. Her mother had actively, deliberately, with a thoroughness that Elsie had only come to understand as she grew older, refused to speak of him, as if he were not a missing piece of a story, but rather a door that had been sealed and plastered over, and then a wall built in front of for good measure. Valen studied her. She could feel it even with her eyes down. The quality of his attention, the way it pressed. Then he said, "You may go." She went. Quickly, quietly, and without looking back. That night she wrote a letter. She sat at the small table in the corner of the shared room after the other 2 maids had fallen asleep, a single candle burning low beside her, and she wrote in the careful, small script her mother had taught her when she was young, back when they still had enough money for paper and ink to be spent on something as impractical as a child's education. "He's asking questions," she wrote. "I don't know what he knows. I don't know what he suspects. But you were right to make me careful, and I am being careful. And I need you to be careful too. Don't talk to anyone who comes from the capital. Don't let anyone inside who you don't already know. I will come as soon as I can." She folded it twice, sealed it with a drop of candle wax, and addressed it to a name that wasn't her mother's real name. Another precaution, another layer in the system of small protections they had built between them over the years. In the morning, she gave it to a supply driver she had trusted for 3 years, slipping it into his coat pocket along with 2 of the copper coins she had saved from her monthly wage. "Caro's Mill," she murmured. He nodded without looking at her and climbed up onto his cart. The Alpha King's castle had many eyes. Elsie knew this. She had always known this. There were the official eyes, the guards, the council members, the court functionaries who tracked movement and recorded names and kept careful accounting of who went where and spoke to whom. And then there were the unofficial ones, the other servants, who talked, because servants always talked, because talk was one of the few currencies available to people with no other kind. Information traveled through the lower corridors of that castle faster than it traveled through the council chambers, and Elsie had spent 4 years learning how to move through it without disturbing the current. But something had shifted. She noticed it first in the way conversation stopped when she approached. A beat of silence, just slightly too deliberate. Then in the way Marta, the head housekeeper, assigned her tasks for 3 days running that kept her in the East Wing rather than rotating her through the castle as usual. Marta was a practical woman who ran the domestic staff with the efficiency of a military operation, and she did not change routines without reason. Someone had told Marta to keep Elsie in one place, so that she could be found, Elsie thought, so that she could be watched. On the 4th evening, she was crossing the lower courtyard with a bundle of ash-stained cloth from the great hall's fireplaces when she became aware that someone was following her. Not a guard. The footsteps were wrong, too soft, too deliberate in their softness. Someone who didn't want to be heard but wasn't quite skilled enough to manage it completely. She kept walking, turned left at the old well instead of right, which took her down the longer path toward the laundry, more open, more lit. She heard the following footsteps adjust, recalculate, then continue. At the laundry door, she stopped and turned. The man who'd been following her was perhaps 40, with a forgettable face and the kind of deliberately plain clothing that people wore when they were trying very hard not to look like anything in particular. He stopped 10 feet away when she turned and had the expression of someone caught mid-performance. They looked at each other. "You're not very good at this," she said very quietly. He blinked. Then something that might have been the ghost of appreciation crossed his face. "Better than most notice. What do you want?" He glanced around the courtyard. "Nothing, at present. Only to introduce myself." He paused. "My name is Doran. I serve the king directly." Her pulse spiked, but she kept her face smooth. "Then you've introduced yourself. Good evening." She pushed through the laundry door. She did not sleep well that night. By morning, she had made a decision. She had 3 days before her next scheduled half-day leave. She was not going to wait for it. She was going to Caro's Mill. She left before dawn on a Tuesday, which was the day the Eastern Gate saw the most cart traffic, merchants, grain suppliers, the weekly livestock transfer, and therefore the day when one more body moving through it attracted the least attention. She wore her second uniform, the one without the castle's embroidered mark on the collar, and she carried a basket of wrapped bread and dried herbs that she had assembled the night before, which made her look like any village woman returning from a market. She had done this before, not often, and never when she felt watched. But she had done it. The road north was cold. The trees on either side had gone fully bare, their branches interlacing overhead like the fingers of praying hands, and the wind came down from the mountains with a bite that found every gap in her cloak. She pulled it tighter and walked faster. 2 days on foot. She couldn't afford the post horse, not without drawing records. And the light was already thin and gray by the time the capital's walls disappeared behind the first hill. She was 3 miles out when she heard the horse. Single rider, moving at a pace that wasn't rushing but wasn't casual either. She kept walking, didn't look back. The road was public. Plenty of reasons for a rider to be on it. The horse slowed as it drew level with her. She looked up. Valen looked down. He was alone. No guard, no Doran, no entourage. Just him on a dark horse, in his plain riding coat, with those gray eyes that gave nothing away and that she was beginning to understand, never would. A long moment of silence passed between them. The wind moved through the bare branches above. Somewhere a crow called out, and went quiet. "Caro's Mill," he said. "That's a long walk." She said nothing. "I'll ride with you," he said. And somehow, impossibly, it did not sound like a king's command. It sounded almost like asking. She almost said no. The word was right there, assembled and ready. "No, Your Majesty. Please don't trouble yourself. I'm perfectly capable of walking." And it would have been the sensible thing, the safe thing, the thing that every instinct she had, carefully sharpened over 23 years of careful living, was telling her to say. But he was already dismounting. He did it without ceremony. Swung down from the dark horse with the easy movement of a man who had spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it, and landed on the road beside her with a quiet crunch of gravel. Up close, he was larger than he seemed from a distance, which shouldn't have been possible given that he was already the largest presence in any room he entered, but somehow it was true. She came to his shoulder. She was not a small woman. He took the horse's reins in one hand and began walking. Not ahead of her. Beside her. She stood on the road for 3 full seconds, long enough that it became obvious she was standing there. And then she started walking too, because there was genuinely nothing else to do. They walked in silence for a long time. The road wound between the bare-limbed trees, frost-hardened mud beneath their feet, the sky above pressing down gray and low. The horse walked quietly behind them, its breath making small clouds in the cold air. A good animal, she noticed. Well-mannered, no fidgeting, no pulling at the reins. It said something about a person, how their horse behaved on an empty road. "You left without requesting leave," he said eventually. "I know. Marta will reassign your morning duties. I know that too." Another silence. Then, "You're not going to explain?" "No," she said. And then, because honesty sometimes worked as its own kind of armor, "You already know where I'm going and why. Explaining would be wasting both our time." He glanced at her sideways. She didn't look at him, kept her eyes on the road, but she felt it. The slight shift of his attention, something recalibrating. "You're not afraid of me," he said, thoughtful, almost puzzled. "I didn't say that. You're talking to me like a person talking to another person," she said quietly. "I apologize if it's inappropriate, Your Majesty. I can stop." "Don't." The word came out faster than his usual measured pace, and she thought, though she couldn't be certain, that it surprised him slightly too. They walked on. They stopped at midday at a stone bridge over a narrow river, where Valen unpacked a saddlebag with the pragmatic efficiency of a man who planned things without announcing that he was planning them. Hard bread, dried meat, a small block of aged cheese wrapped in cloth, a flask of something that turned out to be hot tea, somehow still warm, which meant the flask was lined, which meant he had thought about this before he'd ridden out that morning. He had known she was leaving before she left. She sat on the bridge wall and accepted the bread he offered and thought about that. "Doran told you," she said. "Doran tells me most things. He's not very subtle. He's not meant to be subtle with me, only with other people." He leaned against the bridge wall across from her, looking out at the river. The water was low and very clear, running fast over brown stones. "He told me you noticed him in under 2 minutes. 3, she said. "I wanted to be sure." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. She wasn't sure his face did smiles in any conventional sense, but something adjacent to it. A slight easing around the eyes. "Why are you going to your mother?" he asked. She ate a piece of bread and considered her answer. "Because she's alone, and it's been 6 months. That's the reason you're giving me. That's the reason I'm giving anyone." He looked at her then, directly, the way he had in the East Wing corridor, that examining quality, like he was trying to read something written in a language he mostly knew, but had one unfamiliar word in. Elsie. Her name in his mouth again, deliberate. "I am going to find out what I need to find out. You understand that?" "Yes," she said. "It will be easier, for both of us, if you let me." She met his eyes for the first time since he'd dismounted on that road. His gaze was steady and gray, and unexpectedly honest. No performance in it, no theater of power, just a man who wanted something and was, in his way, telling her so directly. "Ask me what you actually want to know," she said. A long pause. The river ran beneath them. Somewhere in the bare trees, a pair of sparrows argued about something. "Your mother," he said finally. "Her name before she married. Do you know it?" The cold that moved through Elsie then had nothing to do with the winter air. "She never married," she said carefully. There was no ceremony. My father left before I was born, as I told you. Her name before she came to Caro's Mill then. She looked at him for a long moment. And then she made a decision. Not because she trusted him. Not yet. But because she was beginning to understand that the tide of whatever this was had already come in, and the question was only whether she swam or was carried. Senna, she said. Her name was Senna. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Something crossed Valen's face. Shock, suppressed so fast she almost missed it. But it was there. Real and unguarded for exactly 1 second before the control came back down like a shutter closing. He looked away, back at the river. We should keep moving, he said. His voice was perfectly even. We'll lose the light. They reached Caro's Mill by late afternoon of the second day. It was exactly what its name suggested. A mill village, clustered around a bend in a wider river than the one they'd crossed. The great wheel still turning slowly in the current, even in the cold. Perhaps 40 houses, stone-walled and low-roofed, smoke rising from most of them in the early dusk. It smelled of wood smoke and fresh-cut pine from the sawmill on the eastern edge, and of bread from somewhere closer, and underneath all of it the particular cold smell of river water in autumn. Her mother's house was at the far end of the village, slightly apart from the others, small, neat. A kitchen garden put to bed for winter behind a low stone wall, the door painted blue. Her mother had always said blue kept spirits away, and Elsie had grown up unable to decide if she believed that or simply wanted to. The door opened before they reached it. Her mother stood in the doorway. Nara was 51 years old, and she had the kind of face that had been beautiful once, in a way that had aged into something better than beauty. Something more lasting, more honest. She was small and slight, silver threaded through dark hair, wearing a heavy wool dress the color of rust, and an expression that Elsie recognized immediately as the controlled face, the face her mother wore when she had already prepared herself for something hard. Her eyes went to Elsie first, relief, quick and real. Then they moved to Valen, standing slightly behind on the path. And Nara went still. Not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of someone who had been expecting something for a very long time and had just seen it arrive on their doorstep. Mama, Elsie said softly, we need to talk. Nara's gaze held on Valen for one more second. Something moved through it, recognition and grief, and something Elsie couldn't name, but that made her chest ache. Then her mother stepped back from the doorway and said, Come in. I'll put water on. Inside, the house was warm and low-ceilinged, the smell of dried herbs and wood smoke, and old timber wrapping around them immediately. Braided onions hung from the rafters. A fire burned low in the hearth. There was a spinning wheel in the corner, and a shelf of clay cups and a table worn smooth by decades of use. Valen had to duck to get through the door. He stood in the center of that small warm room and looked around it, at the shelf, the fire, the herbs, the spinning wheel, with an expression Elsie had never seen on his face before. Not the neutrality of the castle. Not the calculating attention of the corridor and the bridge. Something rawer than that. Something that looked, if she hadn't known better, almost like recognition. Nara set a clay pot over the fire and turned around. You look like your father, she said to Valen. The room went absolutely silent. I wondered, she continued, her voice steady and quiet and heartbreakingly composed, how long it would take. The fire crackled. No one spoke for a long moment. Elsie stood between them, between her mother, still and composed by the hearth, and Valen, who had gone very still in the center of the small room in a way that was entirely different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was controlled. This was the stillness of a man who had just had the ground shift under his feet and was waiting to find out how far it would fall. Sit down, Nara said, quietly, to both of them. Elsie sat. Valen looked at the small wooden chair near the fire, clearly built for someone considerably less than his size, and sat in it anyway, with a careful precision that under any other circumstances might have been almost funny. Nara poured the tea. She did it slowly, with the deliberate attention of someone who needed the ritual of it, the ordinary motions to hold herself together while she assembled what she was about to say. She set a cup in front of each of them, and then sat across the table and folded her hands and looked at Valen. "His name was Edrin," she said. "The king before you. Your father." Elsie felt the words land in the room like stones dropped into still water. "I know my father's name," Valen said. His voice was low and careful. "Then you know he traveled," Nara said. "Before he took the throne, when he was still the crown prince, young enough to move through the world without his title preceding him everywhere he went." She paused. "He came through Caro's mill in the autumn. I was 26. He didn't tell me who he was. Not at first. By the time I understood it, he was already gone, recalled to the capital. The old king had died." "My grandfather," Valen said. "Yes." Nara's hands tightened slightly around her cup. "He sent word, once, after he was crowned. He said he was sorry. He said it wasn't possible. He sent money, enough to keep us comfortable if we were careful, which we were." She looked at Elsie then, and the love in that look was enormous and uncomplicated, and it made Elsie's throat tighten. "He asked me to keep her safe, to keep her quiet, to never come to the capital." The silence that followed had weight to it. "Her," Valen said. "Yes." He turned to look at Elsie. She watched it happen. Watched the mathematics of it work through his expression, the dates, the ages, the geography. The name Senna that she had given him on the bridge, and that had hit him like something thrown. She watched him arrive at the conclusion she had been living inside of her entire life. "She's his daughter," Valen said, very quietly. "Yes," Nara said, "which makes her—" "Your half-sister," Nara said. "Yes." Elsie had known since she was 16. Her mother had told her on the evening of her birthday, sitting at this same table by this same fire, with the same composed and careful voice that Nara used for all the hardest things. She had laid it out plainly, who her father was, what it meant, why it had to stay buried. The old king was dead by then, and Valen had been on the throne for 3 years, young and already formidable, and Nara had said, "He must never know. Not because he would harm you. I don't think he is that kind of man. But because knowledge like this is dangerous, Elsie. For you. For us. There are people around him who would see you as a threat to be removed." Elsie had spent 7 years carrying it. She looked across the table at her half-brother, the Alpha King, the man whose castle she had cleaned for 4 years, whose corridors she had navigated invisibly, whose name people spoke with a mixture of respect and fear, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear, not even relief exactly, that the secret was finally in the open. Something more complicated. A grief she hadn't known she was holding, for a father she'd never had, and a life she'd never been allowed to claim. And underneath that grief, unexpectedly, something almost like curiosity. About who he was. What kind of man. Valen was looking at her too. 4 years, he said. 4 years, she confirmed. You were in my castle for 4 years, knowing that it had to stay secret. Yes. She kept her voice even. My mother made a promise. I kept it. To protect yourself. To protect her. She glanced at Nara. She was the one who made the agreement with your father. She was the one who kept it for 23 years. I wasn't going to be the reason it fell apart. Something moved through his expression. Not anger. She had braced for anger, the reflexive fury of a powerful man who discovers he has been kept in the dark. But what she saw was not anger. It was something that looked painfully like guilt. I've been asking questions for 3 weeks, he said. Since I found the records. Nara went still. What records? My father kept records of everything. It was... He paused, seemed to find the word. Meticulous, inadequate, and discard it. Comprehensive. There was a ledger. Payments made to a woman in Caro's mill beginning 30 years ago. Regular, until his death. then transferred to a trust I had no knowledge of until my own auditors found it last month." He looked at Nara. "He made sure you were provided for, even after." Nara was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said softly. "I didn't stop being grateful for it." "He never told me," Valen said. And there it was, not accusation, but something genuine and unguarded. "He died and didn't tell me." "He was protecting her," Nara said. "The same way I was. The same way she was protecting herself." Her eyes moved between them both. "You are all, in your different ways, your father's children." They stayed the night. There was no question of traveling back in the dark, and Nara, practical to her bones, simply set about making up the small back room for Valen with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who had survived harder things than hosting kings. He tried to say it wasn't necessary. She handed him a wool blanket and pointed at the room, and he went, which Elsie found quietly remarkable. She helped her mother with supper. Simple things: barley soup, dark bread, a crock of preserved plums that Nara had put up in late summer. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the soup and the wood smoke, and for a while they worked in the comfortable silence they had always had between them. Two people who knew each other well enough not to need words for everything. "Are you angry with me?" Nara asked eventually, quietly. "No. I should have told you sooner, about him being there, at the castle. You didn't know I'd end up there." "No, but when you wrote to tell me where you'd found work." She stopped, stirred the soup. "I was afraid. I thought if I said anything you'd leave, and it seemed safer to have you close to him than wandering. At least if something happened, he might—" She stopped again. "He might protect me," Elsie said, even not knowing. "Yes." Elsie set down the bread knife and looked at her mother. "That's a significant gamble." "I know." Nara looked up. Her eyes were bright but steady. "I'm sorry." Elsie crossed the small kitchen and put her arms around her mother's shoulders, and Nara gripped her hands hard, and they stayed like that for a moment in the warm, soup-scented air while the fire snapped and the winter dark pressed against the shuttered windows. She did not expect to find Valen still awake, but when she came out of the kitchen later to bank the main hearth fire for the night, he was sitting beside it, turned slightly toward the flames, the untouched cup of plum cordial Nara had given him still in his hands. He looked up when she came in. She sat in the chair across from him, the same chair she had sat in at 16 when her mother told her the truth. And they looked at each other in the firelight. "She's remarkable," he said, meaning Nara. "She's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Bitterness, perhaps. Resentment." "She's not bitter," Elsie said. "She made peace with it a long time ago." She paused. "She said he was kind. Your father, that he was sorry. She believed him." Valen looked back at the fire. "He was kind." The words came out careful, like something being handled after long storage. Exacting and sometimes difficult, and always convinced he knew best. But kind. A pause. "I wish he had told me." "What would you have done?" He was quiet for a long moment. The fire settled, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I would like to think I would have done right by you. But I was 24 when I took the throne, and I was—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider. "I was not the same as I am now. I cannot promise what that version of me would have chosen." It was the most honest thing she had ever heard a powerful person say. She thought about the East Wing corridor, the candle, the little boy on the floor with the wooden wolf, the way he had said her name like he was testing its weight. "When did you suspect?" she asked. "The morning I saw you with the boy," he said. "There was something, I couldn't name it then. Something familiar in the way you moved, the way you spoke to him. It stayed with me." He looked at her. "You have his hands, my father's hands. I recognized them and didn't know why." Outside, the wind had picked up. It moved through the eaves of the small house with a long, low sound, and the fire leaned slightly in response, shadows shifting on the walls. "What happens now?" Elsie asked. Valen set down his cup. He looked at her steadily, and for the first time since she had known him, since she had known of him, she saw something in his face that she could name without uncertainty. Resolve. "That," he said, "depends on what you want." What did she want? Elsie turned the question over in her mind the way you turn a stone found on a riverbank, examining it from every angle, testing its weight, wondering what lies underneath it. She had spent so many years wanting only the small and manageable things, enough work to keep her mother provided for, enough invisibility to stay safe, enough distance between herself and the truth to keep both of them breathing without fear. She had never permitted herself to want anything larger than that. "I don't know," she said finally. "I've never been asked." Something shifted in his face. Not pity. She would have closed like a fist against pity. Something more careful than that. A recognition of what it meant, to spend a life in which your wants were not considered a relevant variable. "Then take time to find out," he said. "There's no urgency. The secret has held this long." "There is urgency," she said, "because someone else knows." He went still. "What do you mean?" She had been deciding whether to tell him since the bridge. Since before the bridge, really. Since the moment Doran had appeared in the courtyard with his deliberately forgettable face and his not quite subtle footsteps. Because Doran was Valen's, she was certain of that. But there had been others. 3 weeks ago, she said carefully, a man came to Caro's mill. My mother wrote to tell me. He asked about her history, her name before she came here, whether she'd had contact with anyone from the capital, whether she had children. She paused. "He wasn't yours." Valen's expression hardened. Not toward her. She could feel the direction of it, pointed somewhere else entirely. "Describe him." She relayed what her mother had written. Tall, gray-bearded, a ring on his right hand with a dark stone. Carnelian, her mother had thought. He had been courteous and persistent, and had left without getting much, because Nara was a woman who had spent 30 years being careful and knew how to give nothing while appearing to give something. "Rael," Valen said. The name came out flat and cold. "Who is he?" "My father's brother's son." He said it with the particular economy of someone describing something unpleasant. "My cousin. He sits on the outer council. He has been sitting on the outer council for 12 years, waiting for something he can use." A pause. "He has always believed the throne should have passed through his branch of the family. My father disagreed. I disagreed. The matter was considered settled." "Apparently not," Elsie said. "Apparently not." The fire had burned low. Outside, the wind was steady now, moving through the village with the patient insistence of winter asserting itself, and the small house held its warmth against it, with the determination of something old and well-built. Elsie listened to the wind and thought about Rael. A man she had never met, with a ring she had never seen, who had come to her mother's door, asking questions that could get them both killed. "He's looking for leverage," she said. "Yes. If he finds proof that your father had an illegitimate child, that there is someone with a blood claim, however secondary to the line, he can use it to destabilize your position. Petition the Elder Council. Create doubt." Valen looked at her with that recalibrating expression she was beginning to know. "You understand politics." "I've spent 4 years listening through castle walls," she said. "You absorb things." In the morning, Nara made breakfast. It was a simple meal. Eggs from the 3 hens she kept, dark bread toasted over the fire, a crock of soft cheese and a jar of last summer's honey. She set it on the table without ceremony and sat down and poured tea for all 3 of them. And for a few minutes they simply ate in the pale winter light that came through the single east-facing window. Elsie watched her mother and her half-brother sit at the same table and tried to feel the strangeness of it. She found, to her own surprise, that she mostly felt something quieter. Something that had no good word, but sat in the chest, like the first warmth after a long cold. Valen ate with genuine appetite, which she noted. Men performing graciousness picked at food. He was hungry, and he ate, and he thanked her mother with a directness that had no condescension in it. "I want to tell you what I intend," he said, when the plates were nearly empty. He looked between them both. "And I want you to tell me if you object." Nara set down her cup. "Go on. Rael will move when he believes he has enough. He doesn't yet. Your mother gave him nothing of substance, and the ledger entries are suggestive, but not conclusive without a name to attach them to." He paused. "I intend to remove his ability to use this, not by hiding it further, that hasn't worked and won't, but by controlling how it becomes known, and when, and in what form." "You want to acknowledge her," Nara said, quietly. "I want to give her the choice of being acknowledged," he said. "There is a difference." The room was still. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. "If she chooses it," he continued, "she comes to the capital openly, not as a maid, as my father's daughter with whatever title and provision that merits under the succession laws, which is modest. I won't pretend otherwise. The line is lateral at that distance, but real, documented, protected." He looked at Elsie. "Rael cannot use as a weapon what has already been named and placed in the light." "And if I don't choose it?" Elsie asked. "Then I find another way to neutralize him. It will take longer and be less certain, but it is possible." He met her eyes. "This is not a condition. I am not offering protection in exchange for compliance. I am offering both, separately, because both are owed." Elsie looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she asked. "You didn't know I existed 3 weeks ago. You owe me nothing by any law or custom." "No," he agreed, "but my father did, and he is gone, and someone has to." Rael came to Caro's mill on the 4th day. He arrived in a hired carriage. 2 horses, unremarkable, the kind of anonymous conveyance that people used when they wanted to travel without appearing to. He had 2 men with him who waited by the carriage while he walked up the path to Nara's blue door. He knocked, waited, knocked again. The door opened. Valen stood in the doorway. The silence that followed was considerable. Rael, gray-bearded, carnelian ring catching the cold morning light, looked up at his cousin with an expression that moved through several phases very quickly. Surprise, calculation, and then, settling like sediment, a careful neutrality that fooled neither of them. "Cousin," Rael said, "what an unexpected—" "Come in," Valen said. "We've been expecting you." Elsie was standing by the fire. Her mother sat at the table. Doran, who had arrived quietly the previous evening, having apparently tracked his king to a mill village in the north with the patient efficiency of a man very good at his work, stood near the back wall with his forgettable face and his arms folded. Rael stepped inside and took in the room and understood, in the way that intelligent men understand things they would prefer not to, that he had walked into something he had not prepared for. "You've been asking questions," Valen said, closing the door. "About this woman. About her daughter. About records from my father's reign." "I have an interest in the completeness of the royal archives," Rael said carefully. "You have an interest in the throne," Valen said. "You've had it for years. I've allowed it because interest by itself is not a crime." He paused. Using it to locate and potentially endanger private individuals is different. Rael's eyes moved to Elsie. She held his gaze steadily and watched him work through it. Who she was, what she was doing here, why the king was standing in a village woman's house defending her. "Whatever you imagine," Rael began. "I imagine nothing," Valen said. "I know, and as of 3 days ago, so does the Elder Council. I sent a full accounting before I left the capital. My father's daughter, her name, her lineage, her position." He let that settle. "There is nothing left to expose, Rael. There is no leverage. There is only a question of what you do next, and I would encourage you to choose carefully." Rail was quiet for a long moment. The carnelian ring caught the firelight. Outside, one of his horses shifted and stamped in the cold. "You've made her legitimate," he said finally. "Not a question." "I've made her visible," Valen said. "Which is what she should have been allowed to be all along." Something passed through Rail's face. Not defeat exactly, but the recognition of a game concluded. He was not a stupid man. He looked at Elsie once more, and what she saw in his expression was complex. Frustration, and beneath that, something that might almost have been the ghost of respect for the position she had managed to occupy without anyone noticing. He left without another word. Doran watched him go, and then looked at Valen with the expression of a man who had seen his employer do something unexpected and was quietly revising his understanding of him. The morning Elsie left Caro's mill was cold and bright, the kind of winter day that apologizes for nothing. Hard sunlight, sharp air, frost on every surface throwing light back at the sky. She stood with her mother at the blue door and held her hands for a long time. "You don't have to go back," Nara said. "Not if you don't want to." "I know," Elsie said. "I want to." Her mother looked at her, really looked, the long, searching look of a woman reading her daughter's face for the truth beneath the words. Then she nodded, slowly. "He's a good man," she said. "Better than I feared. Almost what I hoped." "He's difficult and exacting and always convinced he knows best," Elsie said. "Those were your words." "His father's words," Nara said, and smiled. A real smile, the kind that reached everything. "It skips a generation sometimes. The good parts, I mean," Elsie laughed. It came out surprised, genuine, warmer than the winter air deserved. She pressed her mother's hands once more, and then let go. She did not return to the East Wing. Valen had arranged it quietly and thoroughly, the way he arranged most things. A suite of rooms in the North Corridor, modest but real, with a window that looked out over the courtyard, and a writing desk and a shelf that she slowly filled with books over the following months. A title that meant little in ceremonial terms, but meant everything in practical ones. Acknowledged, named, placed in the record. She learned in the months that followed that her half-brother was indeed difficult and exacting and frequently certain he was right. She learned also that he listened, truly listened, when she pushed back, which she did with increasing confidence as winter became spring. She learned that he had a dry and understated humor that appeared only in private, and that he was quietly devastating at chess, and that he checked on their mother with a regularity that no one had asked him to maintain. Doran she came to trust, in time. He was better at his work than she had initially credited. She'd spotted him in 3 minutes because he had allowed it. She eventually understood. A small test, his way of taking the measure of her. Kale, the small border lord's son with the silver eyes and the wooden wolf, came back to the castle in the spring with his father. He found Elsie in the corridor outside the council room, where she had developed the habit of walking in the mornings, and he ran to her with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a child who has found something good and is not confused about it. He still had the wooden wolf. "I kept it," he told her proudly. "You were supposed to put it back," she said. "I know," he said, and grinned, and she thought that 6-year-olds and kings had at least one thing in common. They both did as they liked with the things that mattered to them. Rail resigned from the outer council that summer, citing health. He retired to his family's estate in the east, and was not heard from again in any significant way. Doran kept a quiet watch, as Doran kept quiet watch on most things, but there was nothing to report. Some threats, it turned out, dissolved not because they were defeated, but because the ground they stood on was simply removed. On the first anniversary of the morning, she had walked out of the eastern gate with a basket of bread and dried herbs. Elsie stood at the window of her north corridor rooms and looked out at the courtyard below. The spring was fully arrived, green pushing up between the cobblestones, the old chestnut tree at the courtyard's edge in full leaf, the air smelling of new growth, and somewhere nearby, bread from the kitchens. She heard a knock at her door. Valen stood in the corridor holding 2 cups of tea with the slightly self-conscious expression of a man performing a small domestic act that was entirely beneath his dignity, and doing it anyway. The council meeting is in an hour, he said. I thought you might want to. Yes, she said, taking one of the cups. I do. He nodded, looked out past her at the courtyard. Your mother's letter arrived this morning. She says the kitchen garden is doing well. She always says the kitchen garden is doing well. This time she sent seeds, he said. Apparently she thinks the castle grounds are underperforming. Elsie laughed again, that genuine, unguarded laugh that she was still getting used to having room for. She's not wrong. They stood at the window together for a moment, the tea warm in their hands. The courtyard below busy with the ordinary life of the castle, grooms and carts and the blacksmith's distant ring, the same sounds she had listened to for 4 years from a lower floor, invisible and careful. She was still careful. That did not go away, and she did not expect it to. Careful was a useful thing to be. But it was different now. Chosen rather than required. A tool rather than a cage. She had her name in the record. She had her mother in her letters, and her half-brother in her doorway, and the spring outside her window, and work that was hers to do, and a voice that was hers to use. She had, at last, the shape of a life she had been allowed to choose. The council meeting bell rang across the courtyard, low and clear. Ready? Valen asked. Elsie took a long sip of tea, set the cup on the windowsill, and turned toward the door. Yes, she said. And she was.